Should there not be a patient confidence in the ultimate justice of the people? Is there any better or equal hope in the world? Let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith, let us to the end dare to do our duty as we understand it. And now I will turn it over to Allan for our message today.
Well, somebody quipped that this topic of challenges of democracy isn't a very uplifting thought for Mother's Day. So I'll try to tie it together in the beginning and the end. Your family is not a democracy, okay? Mom rules. When all else fails, ask Grandma. So, I need to also say something about the music today. There was some God language in the songs, and if you ever feel uncomfortable with that, just say a different word like source or life or whatever, and you can get the same concept. And of course, that last song was written in the 19th century, I think, or early 20th century, when there was a lot of optimism about the future. To say, earth shall be fair and all her people one. I don't know if anybody would write that today. But liberal Christianity was in its heyday when those words were written. The theory of evolution suggested that we were getting better and better, evolving upward. But of course, we couldn't say that after World War I and the Great Depression, and that's a whole nother thing. But going back, though, in history, through most of history, monarchy was the form of government. There were kings, and those kings passed on their power by heredity to their family. And if not a king, then there would be a dictator, or a despot, or a Caesar, or military general, or whatever. In Nazi Germany and in communist governments, there were totalitarian regimes which had no tolerance for pluralism. Totalitarian meant they tried to have total control of people's lives. And that was the fate for most people throughout most of history. But then someone coined the term theocracy. That was actually a Roman writer who came up with that word theocracy, which means rule of God. And he wrote that in reference to the Jewish people because of the way that they formed their society. And they felt like God was ruling through a human representative. And of course, in history, the Holy Roman Empire would be another example of theocracy. There are modern theocratic governments in Vatican City, the headquarters of the Catholic Church, and a similar one at Mount Athos in Greece for the Eastern Orthodox Church. There's a small, separate, autonomous area in Greece that has been ruled as a theocracy at Mount Athos for 1,200 years. And of course, there are Islamic theocracies in the world today, including Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Mauritania, and Saudi Arabia. Maybe there's others. And then North Korea would be in a category by itself because of a personality cult centered around the Kim family, and that's something else, but it's sort of a quasi-theocracy, I would say. The whole idea is that God rules. But, this idea of theocracy isn't necessarily so foreign when you stop to think about it in our country. And this is probably the first challenge to democracy that we should think about. Aren't there a lot of people who would say, what if we could just have every American school child say the 10 Commandments and the Lord's Prayer at the beginning of every school day? Go back to those good old days. That's what we call Christian nationalism, or Christian supremacism. They would like to see that happen. Forget about separation of church and state. Let's get on board and have everybody follow Jesus and serve God. And so that's probably the first challenge to democracy that we have in our own country, and it seems to be growing. Then there's the oligarchy. another form of government, which means the people are governed by a small group of wealthy and powerful people. One recent example, of course, is South Africa under apartheid, where the white people had all the wealth and all the power, so an oligarchy based on race. Other African countries with a black oligarchy would include Zanzibar, Liberia, and at one time Rhodesia. Authors Benjamin Page and Jeffrey Winters make a case that would describe all of these countries today as oligarchies. Colombia, Indonesia, Singapore, Philippines, China, Russia, Ukraine, Canada, and the United States. The three characteristics of oligarchies are there's an ownership class, and that class are the largest private owners in the country. They have enough power to advance their own interests, and these owners control multiple businesses, and so they're able to coordinate the activities of those businesses. So if you doubt the theory, just think about the fact that the 400 wealthiest Americans have an amount of wealth equal to half of the entire American population. So oligarchy is a challenge to democracy and a threat that has increased substantially, especially in the wake of the Supreme Court decision called Citizens United, treating businesses as persons for the purpose of campaign contributions. And so money dictates a lot. Meritocracy is a word that is used to say that people are rewarded for their talent and their effort instead of inherited wealth. It's based on your talent and your effort. And this idea, it may not have been used that way, but the idea itself can be traced all the way back to ancient China. Confucius lifted up virtue and honesty instead of bloodlines as being the best way to reward and promote people. And so that was their Chinese civil service system way back in history. The idea was picked up by the British-run East India Company, which eventually influenced the European civil service system. And then on this side of the Atlantic, Thomas Jefferson talked about a natural aristocracy, and according to Jefferson, higher education was the way to cultivate a class of superior leaders for the new country. And so, as you know, Jefferson founded the University of Virginia in his post-presidential career. But Jefferson's proposal about meritocracy didn't last very long. From 1828 to 1883, the United States government used the spoils system for filling government jobs. So in other words, it was based on your political connections, especially with the president. Well, this came to an abrupt end when President James Garfield was assassinated by a disgruntled office seeker. So the spoils system suddenly fell out of favor, and the Pendleton Civil Service Act was passed. Another downside of meritocracy, besides the assassination of a president, is the snowballing effect over the generations. Because when wealth and power become more and more concentrated, there's a widening gap between the super rich and everyone else. And so the lower classes, in recent years, you can think about the opioid epidemic and alcoholism and suicide rates and mental illness, and incidentally, May is Mental Health Month. All of this is, in the eyes of some people, a direct effect of the meritocracy that we have in this country. The idea that we try to reward people based on their success, their hard work, and their talent. And over time, one generation helps another generation to do the same thing, and they become wealthier and more powerful as time goes on. And this is also what has led to the politics of resentment, which we see today, when so many people are feeling left out and feeling dissatisfied, and so then there's the rise of populist candidates who are blaming the upper classes and the people in power for all the problems in their lives. So a recent book by Michael Sandel, professor of philosophy at Harvard, is called The Tyranny of Merit. And so he's talking about the downside of meritocracy. Sandel spoke at Augustana University last fall, you may recall. And I wish I had time to read the whole book, but what I've read is pretty powerful. And so in his conclusion, Sandel gives the example of baseball player Henry Aaron, who was 13 years old when Jackie Robinson became the first black player in Major League Baseball. And so Henry was inspired at age 13 to believe that he too could have a career in the major leagues, but he didn't have either a bat or a ball, so he used a stick to hit bottle caps pitched to him by his brother. And that's how he started his effort to rise up. And of course, Henry Aaron went on to break Babe Ruth's record for career home runs. And so his biographer wrote, "Hitting represents the first meritocracy in Henry Aaron's life." But Sandel takes issue with this and says that the moral of the story is not that we love meritocracy, but that we find ways to overcome system injustice that can only be escaped by hitting home runs. So the point is, being able to rise through equality of opportunity isn't enough. What about all the people who don't rise in spite of their best efforts? Michael Sandel also writes that in 1931, during the Great Depression, an author by the name of James T. Adams, coined the phrase, the American dream. And he's got a really powerful description of this. Page. Writing in 1931, James Adams says this about the American dream. "It is not a dream of motor cars and high wages merely, but a dream of a social order in which each man and each woman shall be able to attain to the fullest stature of which they are capable, and be recognized by others for what they are, regardless of the circumstances or luck of birth or position." And then going on, he points to the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., as a symbol of what democracy can accomplish on its own behalf. He writes, "As one looks down on the general reading room in the Library of Congress, which alone contains 10,000 volumes, which may be read without even the asking, you see seats filled with silent readers, old and young, rich and poor, black and white, the executive and the laborer, the general and the private, the noted scholar and the schoolboy, all reading at their own library, provided by their own democracy." Well, that's a nice, quaint picture from 1931. But obviously, we don't have very many places like that today, where people of all walks of life can meet together and mingle in a way that they did in the Library of Congress. Instead, we have polarization. But polarization is not new. This is something I didn't realize, that our country has been polarized for most of its history. When you think about the struggles over slavery and the Civil War, and then the Jim Crow era in the South, and so on, and then the extreme controversy of the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt's policies, bringing about Social Security and things which are considered mainstays today, but at the time they were radical. And so only from about the 1930s to the 1980s was this country less polarized. And so that's what most of us remember, and that's what we grew up with, is a country that was working together and a government that was functioning pretty well for those 50 years, from the 30s to the 80s. But actually, that period was an aberration, and polarization has been the norm throughout our history. So from that standpoint, we should not be totally pessimistic about the situation today. Well, I found several positive suggestions for things that can be done to improve our democracy and to bring about positive change. Some of them are kind of far-fetched, but some are very practical. Pete Buttigieg, the Secretary of Commerce, has written a book entitled Trust, where he talks about rekindling practices which instill trust in people and in institutions because of the erosion of trust today. An author named Tomasky has a 14-point agenda to reduce polarization. I won't read all of them, but some of them I think are pretty common sense, practical ideas which should be considered. An end to partisan gerrymandering, ranked choice voting in congressional elections, and probably others as well. Eliminating the Senate filibuster, getting rid of the Electoral College, establishing foreign interstate, in-state tuition across red and blue states so that students from red states could go to college in blue states and vice versa, and absorb some of the culture of those so-called foreign places in our country, places that are foreign to their experience, by having in-state tuition being charged. And then in South Dakota, we've heard a presentation about open primaries as well as another effort to reduce the polarization. So there are a lot of good ideas out there, and it's yet to be seen how many of them will actually be put into effect. An author named Ronald Pennock, in the book Democratic Political Theory, has a list of essential criteria for the healthy functioning of a democracy. He suggests attitudes favorable to compromise, habits of political moderation, commitments to procedures that will limit arbitrariness and ensure that decisions are made without haste, and hearing all sides and having adequate information and deliberation. And if he were writing today, he would most likely add also to limit the influence of money in politics, as we've also mentioned already. So there are a lot of great ideas out there. There are some reasons for hope, but also some serious reasons for concern. As I think about this whole topic and don't feel like I've really done it justice in some ways, that I sort of bit off more than I could chew this week. But I hope I've given you some things to think about, and I look forward to your comments in the circle discussion. And I highlighted the fifth and the sixth principles, but then the more I think about it, I think it really comes back to our first principle, most of all, namely the inherent wealth and dignity of every person. And how can we find ways to respect people that we don't like? How can we find ways to at least treat people with respect, even though we disagree with them wholeheartedly? And I think that's the biggest challenge that we face in our society. And I see it all the way to the top. And I find myself wishing that our president, who has shown a huge capacity for compassion in many different ways, from the response to the pandemic and the response to the school shootings and the response to the deaths of American service members, and the list goes on of the compassion that I have seen, and yet I don't hear much compassion expressed for his political enemies. And I sometimes think that if there were a chance to show compassion for those people who are so feeling oppressed or feeling left out or feeling resentful or whatever it is that drives their political energy, they too are human beings, and they too deserve to have be treated with and be aware of the inherent worth and dignity of each one of them. And so that level of compassion, I feel, is missing in all of our political discourse this day. Personally, I find myself having trouble relating to so many of the younger generation. And when I hear that hip-hop music is the most popular form of music today, and I just can't fathom that, and all of the anger and all of the foul language and all of the racial slurs and anti-racial slurs and everything is foreign, and yet they could be my own children and grandchildren or great-grandchildren. And so how can I treat them with respect and respect their inherent worth and dignity? That's, I think, something for us to wrestle with. So, in conclusion, I'm going to come back to Mother's Day. And someone sent me this post about Julia Ward Howe. She's best known as the author of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which, if you stop to think about it, the Battle Hymn of the Republic was a form of theocracy. It was talking about America as a Christian nation during the Civil War, having a just cause that was certainly the will of God himself. That's what it says. But Julia Ward Howe was also a Unitarian Universalist. You may not have known that. And she was an abolitionist. And she began to advocate for annual celebrations of a Mother's Peace Day back in 1870, 5 years after the end of the Civil War. She thought that this special Mother's Peace Day could help to work toward the eradication of war. And she wrote this proclamation: "Arise, all women who have hearts, whether your baptism is a baptism of water or of tears. Say firmly, we will not have great questions decided by irrelevant agencies. Our husbands shall not come to us reeking with carnage for caresses and our applause. Our sons shall not be taken from us to unlearn all that we have been able to teach them about charity and mercy and patience. We women of one country will be too tender of those of another country to allow our sons to be trained to injure theirs. From the bosom of the devastated earth, a voice goes up with our own. It says, disarm, disarm. The sword is not the balance of justice. Blood does not wipe out dishonor, nor violence indicate possession. As men have often forsaken the plow and the anvil at the summons of war, let women now leave all that may be left at home for a great and earnest day of council. Let women meet first as women to bewail and commemorate the dead. Let them also solemnly take counsel with each other as to the means whereby the great human family can live in peace, each learning after their own time the sacred impress not of Caesar, but of divinity. In the name of womanhood and of humanity, I earnestly ask that a general Congress of women, without limit of nationality, may be appointed and held at some place deemed most convenient, and at the earliest period consistent with its objects, to promote the alliance of the different nationalities, the amicable settlement of international questions, the great and general interests of peace." Those were the words of Julia Ward Howe some 150 years ago. May it inspire us, and may it be so.
And so we'll now share the offering to support the work of this congregation, and half of the proceeds, as usual, will go to charity. I don't have my bulletin, so you can find out in your bulletin today. All right. Actually, it's a special charity. I see now that it's the Wo'ohitike, the nonprofit founded by Michael Standing Soldier, which we have special connection to in this congregation to benefit Native persons re-entering from the justice system. So I'd ask you that you would recite with me the words to receive the offering, which are in your program. We give these gifts freely. We receive these gifts gratefully. We dedicate these gifts to the work of our congregation, serving human wholeness, caring for our planet, upholding religious freedom, welcoming the stranger, loving one another. And our final song together will be number 148, Let Freedom Span Both East and West. Please rise as able. And now we'll extinguish our chalice as we prepare to finish up here. And you may read with me the words in your program. The chalice is extinguished, but the light goes with us out into the world. After we leave here, you are invited downstairs for refreshments, and then we will also have a circle discussion at about 11:20. And I'll turn it over to Carol.